I'll call it early. I'm going to have to disappoint you because I don't have any dead cat stories. But I don't think I have half a dozen references to the male appendage in my speech. But we'll have a crack and we'll work through and we'll talk about AA a bit. But like I said, a big afternoon, everyone, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here in Alice Springs at what is a cracking conference and one that I know our team looks forward to very much every year. I do firstly just want to acknowledge the Arunda people and the traditional owners and pay my respects, and that of my company to the elders past, present, and emerging. Before I start talking about AA, I think it's a great opportunity too to congratulate NTCA on their 40th anniversary. And like I said, 2024 is a big milestone for us, and as Pete said, it's 200 years. So it's actually we're actually like the longest running business in Australia that's essentially kept the same name. So we actually claim we'll claim the big gong on that one, even over Westpac, because Westpac changed its name as it went throughout the time. So we are still what we started back then. So yeah, in a couple of weeks' time, in April, it will be essentially 200 years since the company's board met in London, where they sat around a table and decided to kind of get the Australian Agriculture Company going. It was effectively then, that the minutes were taken and that meeting set in motion what is today AACo. See if that's actually a picture of the Royal Charter that was created. So a few months later, in June, an Act of the British Parliament formally established the company and the Royal Charter, signed by King George IV. And in November of that same year, that was the final step in actually setting AACo on its way. The name actually nearly started to be something else. So the original board and the government of the day, when they came up with the idea, wanted to call it the Australia Company. But actually that name had already been taken, funnily enough, by a Scottish company who was basically getting people to move to Australia to work. And so that's where they went back and changed it to the Australian Agriculture Company, which I'm certainly pleased that it ended up being. Like I said earlier, AACo is essentially Australia's oldest continuously operating company, and I think that's a real something to stop and think about. I think what's really cool about that is that essentially that oldest company in Australia is an agricultural company, and today largely is a beef company. And I think that's probably lost on a lot of people in industry and in the Australian side of things. So, and it's a legacy that we are all part of. I think whilst that 200-year milestone is certainly AACo's, we see it more as an opportunity to kind of celebrate with the whole of industry and recognise all of us and the roles that we've all played in making the industry as good as it is today. I think we all achieve great things in this industry every day, and we have done so for many generations. When the first AACo employees set sail from London to Australia, they brought 720 French and Anglo Merino sheep. They brought 12 head of Durham shorthorn cattle and 15 thoroughbred horses. And within 2 decades, there was more than 85,000 sheep, 5,000 cattle, and more than 1,500 horses. One of the purposes in establishing the company was to provide wool back to London, and the original land grant that the company received was focused on finding and creating the best environment for sheep. AACo had more than 210,000 sheep in 1899, and we know that the uniforms that our soldiers wore in the First World War in particular came from wool from the AACo's flock. While AACo actually originated in New South Wales, it is today perhaps more Territorian than anything. It took until the end of World War II before AACo was considered a specialist cattle company, but the transition north began many decades earlier. AACo purchased its first sort of northern property in 1916, which was Headingley Station, which sits on the border there of Queensland and Northern Territory, and then 5 years later bought its first Northern Territory property, which is Avon Downs, where we celebrated that 100-year ownership just prior to COVID. That's a picture of Avon back in the day. In fact, of almost 90 properties that AACo has managed across Australia, Avon Downs was actually the 23rd property that was purchased, which goes to show the long history that we've had here in the Northern Territory. In the years since, we've owned and operated many Northern Territory properties, which include Anthony's, Eva, Austral, Laverne, Benmara, Brunette, Camfield, Delamere, LaBelle, Monogini, Newry, Bell, Rockhampton Downs, Tortilla and Welltree. Today, we own and operate a total of 30 stations, farms and feedlots. But the real bulk of our properties are in Queensland. However, the largest area of our properties is certainly in the Northern Territory. Of the 6.5 million hectares that we operate, 4 million of those are actually based in the Northern Territory. When you consider those properties, over that period of time, there's a good chance that most of you in the room or someone in your family recently or in the past have had a direct connection with AACo. That makes you part of the AACo family and connects you to a unique story. And if you haven't, the good news is there's still time. Whilst our success at internal promotion is certainly something that I think is a strength, we're always on the lookout for passionate people to join the team and guide the business through the next 200 years. We have actually tried to estimate how many employees we've had over the time, which has proved an almost impossible task. Turns out record keeping up to 200 years ago wasn't as good as you thought it might be. But it's safe to say that there's tens of thousands of people that have been employed by AACo over that time. And whilst that's obviously a small fraction of Australian agriculture over the 200-year period, I think one of the unique things about this business is kind of the ripple effect that we have. We recently had a man by the name of John Kelly, who's in the middle of this photo here, actually come to our head office to talk to our employees. He worked for AACo for 41 years, one of the longest serving employees that the company's ever had. He worked on several properties across the business's portfolio and certainly here in the Northern Territory. He has 5 children and all of them were raised on one of the AACo properties, and his son also worked for us. Some of you might know John, and if not John, you might know Bob Young, who worked for the company for 45 years, starting in 1966, or even current employees. For example, Sam Graham, 36 years, Glenn McCamley, 25 years, or the Kane family, who have worked multiple generations for AACo, and Chris and Millie now manage Kenobi Station. They've all spent significant time in the Northern Australia business and in the Northern Territory cattle industry. One of the greatest things about this industry is how it connects generations. It connects people, it connects communities, and it does so in a way that no other industry does. You only need to look at the camaraderie at a conference like this to really understand and see that in action. The Territory is pivotal to who AA is today. Our operations in the Territory include our largely Brahman live export and backgrounding supply chain in the northern end, and to the southeast in the Barkly, a largely composite herd that is the nucleus and a significant proportion of our F1 production system. More recently, we've also established a purebred Wagyu herd at Avon Downs, which is performing above expectations to date. These Wagyu cattle form the basis to what is our largest revenue stream today, being that of branded beef, to David's point, sold around the world. Our history is proof that you can't predict the future with any certainty at all. However, there are plenty of things that we think history can teach us. We haven't always got it right, and not even close. I think examples like Livingston beef are a constant reminder of that. And I know Matt Brand's here today and from ABC, and he asks me every 6 months when we do results what we're doing with Livingston, amongst other people. But knowing what we know now, of course, we would have done things differently at that point. But I think what's important to note is that the people involved at the time thought they were making the right decisions with the information they had. That's the benefit of hindsight. And so, in that vein, and with a view to genuinely wanting to improve our future, perhaps I can share a few stories with you and learnings that we have encountered along the way. The first of these is that the future begins today. And I think we've heard a lot of people up here earlier today with a similar thought process and message. It sounds like such a simple thing, but while taking the first step can sometimes be the hardest, it's also the way to chart a path and that history and that can benefit future generations. The decision to form AACo was based on information from an exploratory visit to Australia back in the 1820s. And in those days, it would have taken months to visit and explore a region, and then up to 6 months to get the information back to London. And then when that information got there, and the manifests, and they needed to get information back to Australia, they would actually draw it up 3 times, put it in 3 different sets of envelopes, and put it on 3 different ships in order to, hopefully, one of those would make it back to Australia. Thankfully, decision-making today should be easier than that, but it doesn't always play out like such. The Northern Territory can be a challenging environment, but having the same visionary mentality to those early industry trailblazers and then the courage to take the first step might be all it takes to create a regional powerhouse. It usually takes good policy to enable progress, and so this message is as true for the government and other decision makers as the rest of us here today. Imagine if the British government decided there wasn't a good enough business case around AA back in 1824. Not only did they make the best decision with the information available at the time, but they also enabled the company by providing a 1 million acre land grant. The company first settled actually around Port Stephens in New South Wales, thinking it would be good for sheep. But when the land wasn't deemed suitable for sheep, and the sheep weren't performing, the company's first chief agent, the CEO if you will, a bloke called Robert Dawson, was sacked. That took about 2 years, and so clearly the trend around CEO tenure at AACo was set early. Arguably, he actually did pretty well, considering the half-life of an AA CEO at the moment is about 18 months. But they probably made the decision 6 months earlier. I had to get it on the boat to get it out there, and so it probably pays out about right. Apart from those fun facts, that's old mate there with a wonderful comb forward type situation. Clearly mullets weren't the go back then, but he's trying hard. So apart from those fun facts, the point here is that when it wasn't going well, they changed their path, they swapped some land for the area and found Tamworth. So it wasn't smooth sailing all the way, and I'll get to that soon, but they made decisions. They pivoted, they made new decisions. They found things that did work along the way. Because of those first steps, towns like Shroud, Barrington in New South Wales now exist. Tamworth was developed. Newcastle and its coal operations expanded. Now, maybe some of those things would have happened anyway, but the outcome would have been very different in any case. They all started by taking the first step, making bold decisions and managing the outcomes with the best available information at the time. We all make decisions every day in our businesses that change the course of our operations. So I often ask myself, and I ask you to consider, when future generations of all our businesses look back at us as decision makers and managers, what will they think of the decisions we made along the way? Were we bold enough? Did we think far enough ahead? What were our guiding principles? And will it be obvious to those future generations whether we were purely surviving or we were actually trying to thrive? The second of these learnings is that we can stand proudly together in support of our industry. And I think we've heard a lot of that today. We live and work in an industry that is great in every sense of the word. It helped build this nation. For our 100th anniversary back in 1924, the following was said about AACo. It could equally be said about any of the businesses here today. The history of the Australian Agricultural Company is interwoven with the history of Australia. It helped to pioneer our country, and its story is one of sterling endeavour, an achievement that in part reads like romance. That's a fitting description of our role in industry, of the role that our industry has played in Australian history. Yet despite our efforts, there are some in the broader community who do their best to talk us down. And we heard lots of examples from Todd earlier today about the amount of groups out there trying to do such. Whether it's live exports, whether it's animal welfare, whether it's First Nations engagement, the environment, or climate change, we are facing an increasing amount of scrutiny. On a global level, our industry can be proud of its records, and we can be proud of our history. Unfortunately, though, we often, and maybe sometimes it's fair, get perceived at home and abroad according to our lowest common denominator. Someone does something wrong, or it's perceived to have all, and someone's done something wrong, and it is perceived to have done something wrong, and it becomes how we are all judged. Just like Australia's history includes a manner of colourful characters, the same is actually true for AACo. This sprightly-looking character here is actually a bloke called Captain Thunderbolt. So one of the country's notorious bushrangers, Frederick Ward, Captain Thunderbolt, actually worked as a stockman on AACo Brindley Station in New South Wales before he took up his career of horse theft. His partner, Marianne Bugg, was also born on AACo's Berrico outstation, where her former convict father was the overseer. So after almost 15 years and numerous prison escapes, he was cornered and shot off the back of his horse by an off-duty policeman. Now, he wasn't an AACo employee during his time on the run, but imagine for a second what the reaction and the response would be if a scandal of this nature were connected to AACo or any one of our companies or the industry today. Times, of course, have changed, and we're expected to change with them. We can't stand still. We need to lift, we need to innovate and challenge ourselves. We can be better when we work together, all of us, towards a common positive future. I'm always open to ideas about the role AACo can play in that drive, and we will proudly stand with you and talk about our achievements, our great history, and our positive future. To that end, I think another learning is that we can always achieve more when we work together. Too often, I feel the broader agricultural sectors appear to be at odds with itself. The industry is made up of a spaghetti map of national, state and commodity-based groups all jockeying for the best positions, often fighting each other for the control of the conversation and to influence the outcomes across a range of areas. Now, I'm not trying to trivialise the issues, the genuine issues. Those organisations play an important role in different situations. However, while we bicker, the world is at risk of passing us by. There are 90,000 agricultural businesses in Australia today, and we heard from Caroline earlier that there are up to 270 different industry associations or bodies representing those businesses. If you allow for the fact that many of the businesses aren't actually members of any association, each body is still representing a very small number of businesses. So it's no wonder more time is spent arguing with each other than making progress. We risk losing key parts of agriculture while we fight for pieces of the pie instead of growing the pie. Whether it's controversy around live animals, crops like rice have high water usages, genetic modification in cotton, agricultural industry shouldn't be us or them. It's not the state of origin. It is not Brahmins or Charolais or sheep versus cattle. Agriculture has to work together. Just like in this image, a couple of years ago, it was actually at the Avon celebration with Will and David and former NT Minister Paul Kirby. We have to find a way for government, industry and business to engage together. We heard earlier today from DC that the NTCA has 90% advocacy for its group, which is exceptional, but unfortunately it is not the norm. And I know that David also sat up here and tried to tell us that size wasn't everything. But I would add to that participation and effort is increasingly important for an enjoyable outcome, though. So while we stumble around trying to find our direction, looking backward or inward instead of forward, the interest groups who want to end our industries are gathering pace. There are only a few dozen of those groups in Australia, but they are organised and they aren't going away anytime soon. The consequence of inaction could be profound. Governments can end or cripple us with the stroke of a pen, though it's more likely to happen a little bit at a time, as if by stealth. Take the EU deforestation regulations as an example, which have the potential to impact market access to that region for multiple industries, including beef. There is a view out there that it's just the EU, so it's not a big deal, but we know that other markets are keeping a close eye on the outcomes of this. We weren't always this fragmented. AACo's original prospectus actually talked about producing olives, vines, tobacco, hemp, flax, silk, opium, sheep wool, meat, wheat, cattle, and horses. It does make me wonder where we would be today if we'd gone long in the hemp and opium trade. But we are where we are. Without the industry politics and the heavy government intervention, we were able to get on with the job and producing food and fibre. Times may have changed, but the sentiment is the same. And as we become more united, the fight to secure our industry for future generations will get easier. Which leads me to my next, and perhaps the most important learning, I think, is that we must adapt to survive. AACo started primarily as a sheep and wool operation, with cattle and some cropping supplementing the business. However, while beef was always in our blood, it took several events, converging in the 1950s, before the focus fully turned to cattle. Despite a wool price boom in that same decade, AACo also lost heavy losses of sheep in floods. And at the new agreement with Britain and a beef shortage in the US made beef an increasingly attractive proposition. By the end of the 1950s, the company had 140,000 sheep and 136,000 cattle. However, despite those relatively even numbers, 75% of AACo's income came from beef. Until then, it was all shorthorns, but change was around the corner. The next general superintendent at the time, a bloke called Rudolf Schmidt, travelled to the US to procure polled shorthorn bulls. But instead, he was so impressed with the potential of the Santa Gertrudis that he set about implementing a program to gradually replace all the shorthorns with Santas. So they set up a Santa Gertrudis stud at Goonoo Station in New South Wales, which was a success, and the breed was highlighted during a royal tour, actually, in the 1970s. They weren't for everywhere, though. They'd sent some up to Rotham Park. They'd not done very well, so they swapped them out for Brahmins. We also developed our own composite breed, the Mitchell, named after the most abundant of grasses on our properties, which was designed to thrive in the Northern Australian climate. It's a mix of at least 6 breeds. It's got Brahman in it, Santa in it, Charolais, Red Angus, Senepal, Bonsmara, amongst a few others. AACo's moved from shorthorns to Santas, then to Brahmins and composites, and now to Wagyu is another example of the decision-making I mentioned earlier. We have and will continue to invest heavily in genetics over the past 200 years and the next. Our vertically integrated supply chain allows us to own the full life cycle and take greater control of the herd, aiming for constant improvement. We take carcass information from the progeny of our bulls that we breed, along with grow safe information, along with information like David was talking about earlier, and close the loop with genetics for the next generation. Then we repeat that process again and again and again. We've done that over many decades to get where we are now. Composites became the answer to the question, how do you find a more productive cattle that can live in the north? It wasn't about specific breeds. We bred for traits. Some of these include productivity, reproductive, survivability, and meat quality. They are all traits that speak to both the producer and the consumer. Neither focus on their own will deliver a sustainable profitability for this business. That consumer focus actually prompted the move towards becoming a premium beef producer, of which another brave decision was made with the purchase of the Westholme Wagyu herd in 2006. The Westholme herd contains some of the most highly credentialed full-blood Japanese black Wagyu animals ever to leave Japan. They were also the last, with after that Japan refusing to export Wagyu genetics from that time on. The transition to Wagyu was a fundamental shift in the beef strategy. Premium, top-quality restaurant quality product claims high prices around the world, and that has enabled AACo to shift away from a reliance on cattle prices as the primary driver of our financial performance. AACo has several Wagyu brands. Named after the herd, Westholme is AACo's flagship Wagyu brand and is enjoyed at some of the finest restaurants around the world. Darling Downs is a household name in Korea, where it recently celebrated 20 years in the country. We have adapted over time, and while not every year was a roaring success, the fact that we are still here speaks volumes. The original shareholders took a risk, and now we stand as Australia's biggest cattle company. Of course, we've had our challenges, even in recent times. It is an understatement to say that we have not always been financially viable or successful, and it's been some time since we paid a dividend. But like all agricultural businesses, there have been years where we haven't performed. But we have survived all of the droughts, all of the floods, and we're still here fighting alongside the rest of you today. And I can assure you as I stand here that we have the plans and the aspiration to be better tomorrow than we are today. Just like our shift from sheep to cattle back in the 1950s, AACo and all of us are at another point in time where we must adapt to survive. Sustainability is the new challenge, or is it the opportunity? Deforestation, emissions, biodiversity and nature, animal welfare, species and habitat loss, and land degradation. Now, how we respond to all of these things will influence our ability to operate, our social licence, if you will, as well as market access both here and abroad. I suspect time will show that this is a real fork in the road. We will find that it becomes increasingly harder to justify inaction, and we certainly can't avoid it on ideological grounds. At a basic level, our operations rely on nature. So it makes sense that if we improve the nature that we operate in, if we can start to have a positive impact on nature, we will be more productive and more efficient. Now, our 200th anniversary shows that by definition, AACo has been sustainable. Today, sustainability is about more than just financial resilience. AACo takes a holistic view of sustainability. Ultimately, we start with nature. And for us, that's about ensuring our cattle production systems create a positive outcome for the natural assets we manage, and of course, positive returns for the company. Our cattle operations span over 6.5 million hectares of land, and the focus in recent times is as much about how we are doing it as what we are doing. We believe now that through the how we operate, we can be a part of the solution to addressing nature-related challenges, which will lead to a positive impact on climate. The two are not mutually exclusive. The parameters have changed, but so too has the technology we've heard of today, the science and the understanding of how we can make a difference over time. And we do want to make a difference. Even if you set aside the positive impact that we can have on the climate, there are practical realities that we must consider. Well, customers and consumers increasingly expect it. If we don't act, regulators will begin to demand it, finance will become harder to get without it, the media will challenge us if we don't, and markets will begin to close if we don't respond to it. It's a challenge, but I honestly believe it is one of our greatest opportunities. New revenue streams will open to us through numerous different ways, carbon, biodiversity, as David spoke to earlier, and we can diversify and consider alternate uses for the vast tracts of lands that we operate on that are symbiotic with our current cattle businesses, but it will still demand change. Finally, while it can often seem complex, the pathway forward and the key to the future is simple. The industry has always had its ups and downs, and AACo by no means is any different. Our challenges are well and truly documented. Over the course of time, more has probably been written about AACo than any other agricultural company in Australia. In fact, there was a book launched just the other day about the early history of AACo, written by a New South Wales historian. But while AACo has evolved in many different ways, the core is very much the same. It's about the people, animals, and our land. That's what it was in 1824, and that's what our focus is today. One of the earliest and perhaps youngest employees in our history was a 15-year-old who was orphaned in England and chose to sign up for work with the newly formed Australian Agricultural Company. The boy was taken under the wing of the then chief agent, Robert Dawson, and made a successful life for himself in Australia. He's a distant relative of the man by the name of Rodney Gorton, who lives at Stroud, where the company was once headquartered. That's Rodney on the right. So a few years back, the Gortons actually held a family reunion and more than 800 people came from around Australia. Incidentally, Rodney still runs shorthorn cattle. Remember the story I shared early at the beginning about the ripple effect our industry has? As far back as our company has been in operation, care for its people has been a value, and generations of people have benefited. It's sometimes easy to overcomplicate what we do, but I think it's pretty simple. By focusing on people, the land, and our animals, we will perform better, produce better, and healthier landscapes and animals, and create better outcomes for all of us, including our consumers. If we keep doing that, we can get ourselves set up for the next 200 years and beyond. I appreciate the opportunity, to share some of my thoughts with you today, and I hope there's a little something in there for everyone. As a company and as individuals, we're not always at our best or delivering perfection, but we are trying to be better. We can't change the past, but I hope we as a beef industry and as agriculture more broadly can work to a common future, and the challenges we will face are better faced together. AACo is just one part of that landscape, but I can assure you we are going to continually evolve, continually develop our people, improve the land we operate on and assets, and carefully manage our animals alongside all of you and be very proud of it. Once again, big thank you to the NTCA for having me here today, and may we long celebrate and be proud of the industry that we're involved in. Thank you.